able to join us because we advertised that Jeff would briefly introduce or provide an overview of our honor society, the Order of the Sword and Shield, where he's the founding director, and we're happy to work with him. And this is a great opportunity for students, to enter the honor society world if they choose or have a desire to do so. And we are proud that a couple of years ago, we founded our own chapter of Omicron Sigma, the Order of the Sword and Shield honor society at Penn State. So we have an own chapter, and this lecture series here is also to serve among current students, our chapter students and alumni who are in the chapter, and so on and so forth. So it would have been a great opportunity to learn firsthand about the Order of the Sword and Shield, but do not be disappointed because I am going to post the link in the chat. It's pretty, the honor society is pretty self-explanatory, as is the application process. The good news is because we are a trusted program, one of the founding members, if you will, our students are waived the reference letter requirement. So you may go ahead and apply without a reference letter. You could just put waive or my name in the references section, but you do not need to solicit any references because this is a trusted program. So if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. As you know, my email address is aus50@psu.edu, with any questions about the honor society. So then, without further ado, I'm so glad that we have Charles Djou with us tonight. Charles is actually technically is right next door because he is currently a student, a very advanced and senior student, but a student at the U.S. Army War College, 40 minutes from us here in Carlisle, in Pennsylvania. He is an Army Reserve Lieutenant Colonel, but is a student at the War College where he's pursuing his Master of Arts in Strategic Studies. He will speak to us tonight about an insider's view of federal budgeting, of the federal budgeting process with a focus on Homeland Security, and he is perfectly equipped to do so, as you will see in a moment when I'll take just a minute to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight. In the meantime, can I ask you to use the chat box, not the Q&A, but the chat box, to briefly introduce yourself in a sentence or two? You know the drill if you have participated before. If you are new to this, you will please do so as well, because it helps our speaker as he delivers his remarks to understand, to better understand, understand and develop his audience, and then be able to focus his remarks, so to give you a better outcome here, and then also as a courtesy. And as you know, same drill as before. We'll leave it up to the speaker how he would like to divide up his time. So we have till 6 p.m. So it's up to the speaker to determine. It's up to the speaker's discretion. I would like to use the time they would present, break in the middle, discuss, move on, or leave at the end. Questions for Q&A. But as you introduced yourself over the chat, please wait a few minutes and then also start to leave any questions that you have for Q&A on the chat for efficiency reasons. So that will be appreciated. So Charles Djou represented Hawaii's 1st congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives. So is Congressman Djou, where he served on the armed services and the budget committees. You see the connection to his topic tonight. Prior to his election to Congress, Djou won elections to the Honolulu City Council, where he chaired the zoning committee, and the Hawaii State House of Representatives, where he served as the minority floor leader. Djou is a former professor at the University of Hawaii School of Law and continues to teach as an adjunct professor of political science at Hawaii Pacific University. Charles Djou currently works as the Chief of National Security Law at the 9th Mission Support Command at Fort Shafter, Hawaii. He is on leave from this position while pursuing his Master of Strategic Studies degree over at the U.S. Army War College. He is an Afghanistan War veteran and, like I said, a Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve. He holds a business degree and graduated magna cum laude with distinction from the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Finance, very great place. He earned his law degree from the University of Southern California, Galt School of Law, and he expects to complete his master's in strategic studies degree from the US Army War College in June 2021. Best wishes for that. And thank you, Charles, if I may, for joining us tonight. And we are so much looking forward to your talk. It's great to have you. Thank you so much. Floor is all yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Alex. Thank you. That was a delightful introduction. Thank you very much. Alison, thank you also for helping to set it up. It's a delight and a pleasure to talk to all of you here at Penn State virtually. I'm hoping this COVID stuff eventually winds down and maybe we can have more in-person interaction. But until then, we do it over a laptop. So Alison and Penn State asked me to come and chat this evening a little bit about the federal budgeting process. I'm delighted to talk about that. I have served in the U.S. House on both the Armed Services Committee as well as on the Budget Committee, so hopefully can give a little bit of background on federal budgeting. I also be very happy to chat, having served in both the Honolulu City Council as well as the Hawaii State House of Representatives, to talk about how budgeting works at the municipal level of government as well as the state level of government. And of course, being a Army reservist, having served in Afghanistan, also be very happy to share about my background and discuss a little bit about what it's like to serve and what it's like to be in the military. I understand a lot of you have a military background and have experience with the armed services. Let me also just add here, yes, I am actually right now physically in Central Pennsylvania working on my master's as a resident student at the U.S. Army War College. But I am, of course, from the state of Hawaii. That's where I am from. That's where I grew up. That's where my wife and my children still are. When all this COVID stuff calms down here, our economy is really reeling from no travel and no airfare. So come and visit us in the Hawaiian Islands after all this. Maybe after you graduate from Penn State, okay? Put it as a graduation present to come visit the Hawaiian Islands. So let me start off, just maybe explain to you a little bit about the federal budgeting process. One of the most important things I think I want to convey to folks, especially for all of you who are working on graduate degrees in the Homeland Security field, is there's very frequently misunderstanding about some of the key terms and how budgeting officials and how the United States Congress comes together and crafts a budget. Now, I'm assuming all of you understand the basics. The president submits a budget, Congress passes it, it's $3 trillion. We're running multi-trillion-dollar budget deficits. But I want to get a little bit more into the minutia. And of course, I'm very, very happy to take questions from any of you. I think the first thing that I want to convey, and really honestly, of all the things I say here today, if the only thing you remember is the difference between a budget authorization, a budget appropriation, and then a budget encumbrance or obligation, if you just understand those three key set terms, 90% of your problems and issues with federal budgeting will become much, much, much clearer, okay? People a lot of folks after they get out and start working in the federal government and they hear these terms, authorization, appropriation, encumbrance, and it gets very, very, very confusing. So maybe let me start off by just explaining these terms and then help you all understand how to conceptualize it. And then maybe I can get into a little bit more weeds and details here, okay? So the first thing to understand is a authorization. What an authorization is the United States Congress tells a government agency like the Department of Homeland Security, you may do something, okay? Think of it this way. A budget authorization is like a fishing license, okay? It means that the Congress is telling an agency, well, yeah, you can go out and you can do this, or this is a mission function of your particular agency. Okay, so putting it in a Homeland Security context, let me give you an example. An example of, and I'm not sure these are exact numbers, but an illustration of this would be, say, for example, Congress tells Customs and Border Patrol that you are authorized to go use 20 blimps to monitor the US-Mexico border. Okay, that is an example of a congressional authorization. And although it comes from the floor, the House floor and the Senate floor, who ultimately vote upon it, the real committee that really drills down and works on these authorizations is a subject matter committee. And for Homeland Security, that's going to be the US Senate and the US House Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs. Okay. So that subject matter committee, they're the ones working on these authorizations. And again, keep it in mind in your head, an authorization is like a fishing license, okay? If you keep that straight, you won't get steered wrong, okay? Now, the next step, after you get a congressional authorization, just like a fishing license, just because you got a fishing license does not mean you automatically get a fish, right? I mean, state Pennsylvania says you can go throw your rod in, whatever, the Cumberland River, but just because you can do it doesn't mean you get the fish. Same way in the United States Congress, okay? Just because Congress tells an agency you can do something does not mean the United States Congress is going to pay for it, okay? If you actually want money, you need appropriation, okay? And that's the key distinction between a congressional authorization and a congressional appropriation. Think of it this way. Congressional authorizations in the budgeting process, they're the fishing license. It just says you can go out and fish. The appropriation is the actual fish itself. Okay, so again, let me use the analogy I started with already. Okay, Congress goes out and authorizes Customs and Border Patrol to say you can use 20 blimps to monitor the US-Mexico border. Now, just because Congress authorized CPB to go and monitor the US-Mexico border with 20 blimps does not mean Congress is going to pay for 20 blimps. The Customs and Border Patrol, or the US Department of Homeland Security, still needs to go to the Appropriations Committee, House Appropriations and Senate Appropriations, and actually get the money to go out and buy 20 blimps. And just like when you get a fishing license, there is no guarantee that you actually catch a fish. Just because you have a congressional authorization, there is no guarantee that you're going to get your appropriation. And it is not uncommon to see in Congress that even though the Homeland Security Committee authorizes 20 blimps, Congress might actually only appropriate 12 blimps or 15 blimps, some number smaller than what's actually authorized. Now, the Appropriations Committee cannot appropriate more money than what is authorized. In other words, if the Homeland Security Committee tells Customs and Border Patrol you can have 20 blimps, the Appropriations Committee cannot come back and appropriate money for 21 blimps or 22 blimps. But they definitely can, and very frequently do, appropriate much less than the authorized amount from the subject matter committees, okay? So again, keep this straight in your head. Authorization, fishing license. Appropriation, that's the actual fish, okay? Now, the third thing that confuses a lot of people in the budgeting process is this concept of an encumbrance or a obligation. The US Defense Department uses the term obligation. Most of the other agencies use the term encumbrance, but they mean the same thing, okay? Encumbrance or authorization. This is a federal executive branch decision. After something has been authorized and it has been appropriated for, the last step then is usually it's somebody relatively high up in the agency encumbers or obligates the funds. Usually, I think I'm actually not 100% certain what the exact number is for the Department of Homeland Security, but usually it's like if it's in excess of $10 million, typically it's an assistant secretary who is doing the encumbrance or the obligation. Okay, encumbrance and obligations. The way, again, to think about it in your head is to think about it like a fish dinner. Okay, if you go into a restaurant and you order a fish dinner from the waiter, right? You got to pay for it. It doesn't matter whether or not you eat the dinner. If you order the fish dinner, you have to pay the restaurant for the fish dinner, even if you don't even touch the food and you never eat it, okay? With federal obligations and encumbrances, it's the same thing. If an assistant secretary encumbers funds and says, you're going to do this, it doesn't matter. If you go back and you say to your boss, hey, look, boss, why are we buying this? Why are we buying 20 blimps to watch the US-Mexico border? It's a completely asinine, dumb idea. We can buy triple the number of, remote piloted aircraft that'll do much more, far more flexible, way better monitoring of the US-Mexico border. Why are we buying all these blimps? Well, if the assistant secretary obligated those funds, it doesn't matter. You're going to have to pay for it, whether or not you want that particular program, okay? So if you keep these three thoughts in mind in the federal budgeting process, authorizations is a fishing license, appropriations is the fish, and an encumbrance or obligation is the fish dinner. If you keep those three things straight in your head, I think probably 90% of the confusion of most civil servants, most people working with the federal government, 90% of your questions, issues will probably get addressed, okay? Some of the things to just highlight, maybe perhaps for all of you in the budgeting process and to explain it a little bit more. A couple of agencies, the Defense Department being one of them, the Defense Department being the biggest, does the authorization program annually. So the US Defense Department once a year has to get and pass something called the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. And it is done once a year, every single year. In other words, they have to go out and get that fishing license once a year, every single year. That actually is the exception. Most federal agencies, they do the authorization process on an ad hoc basis. So again, putting it in the context of Homeland Security, when the Department of Homeland Security was originally created, I think it was 2002, maybe it was 2003, there was an authorization act for the entire agency, telling the agency what it can and cannot do. Then over time, Congress can layer on and add additional authorizations or pull them away. It's not a formal process like it is in the US Defense Department. Most of the federal agencies, Department of Education, Department of Interior, Department of Agriculture, they also do it in the same way. There's an initial authorization act, and then Congress just makes decisions as issues come up, deciding what to authorize and not authorize, rather than a continual annual basis, as is done with DoD. The only other agency that's kind of somewhat similar to the US Defense Department is the US Transportation Department, which does a more regular authorizations in terms of what transportation can and cannot do. And to no surprise, those two particular agencies have the biggest loads of discretionary money, and to no surprise, members of Congress are most interested in those particular agencies, the Defense Department and the Transportation Department, because to no surprise, congressional pork is very much dependent on those two particular agencies. The Defense Department, because it spends close to $1 trillion a year. Transportation Department, because constituents care a lot about whether or not you get a highway on-ramp and I-95, whether or not there's an expansion of the local airport, whether or not a particular harbor or not gets dredged, or you can add additional ships. That's why there's particular interest in all of that. Another aspect I want to highlight, perhaps for all of you, and then I'd like to save about half of my time here for Q&A. After all, I'm a politician. I can keep talking as long as you guys want me to keep talking. Another aspect I want people to understand about Congress, kind of sort of an insider view that, I mean, a lot of people, I think, oftentimes misunderstand Congress, and that is members of Congress, and keep this is a central point. Members of the United States Congress are not elected by the American people. Members of Congress are elected by voters in their congressional district. That is a key distinction. And I was when I was in Congress, so frequently surprised how many very, very bright people did not understand that concept. They would come in to a committee, I served on armed services, and come in with these plans and come in with these designs, and then explain why this particular program or this particular proposal was a really, really great idea for the United States of America, or why it was a really, really great idea, in my case on armed services, why it was a really great idea for the United States Army. And then would be taken aback by congressmen, didn't seem very interested in a particular program that might be good for America. It's because congressmen, you got to understand, are motivated by the people who can hire and fire them. And the American people, as a broad general statement, do not hire and fire congressmen. It's only the voters in their district who hire and fire them. And so as a consequence of that here, and I hope many of you one day rise up to positions and give testimony before the United States Congress, you have to understand that psychology of members of Congress here. And it is important to make sure whenever you're before Congress and trying to push a particular piece of legislation, find a way to make that proposal, find a way to make your concept connect and link with that particular member's district or their particular home state. It'll just make things a heck of a lot smoother. And you know, I'll say from my own personal standpoint, you know, when having served in Congress, you know, I served in the Army. I'm still in the United States Army Reserve. I mean, I think I have a general understanding of the American military. But even I have to confess, you know, when I was sitting on the Armed Services Committee, keeping in mind I represented the state of Hawaii. If a general or an admiral was coming in front of me and testifying in front of me and giving all these statistics and all these general things, you know, I would sincerely listen. But all of a sudden, if they started talking about Pearl Harbor in the Pacific Fleet, or they started talking about Hickam Air Force Base and the Pacific Air Force, I mean, I'll be honest, my ears would perk up. I mean, I suddenly became a heck of a lot more interested in what this general or admiral had to say in terms of how it was affecting the Pacific and how it would affect the state of Hawaii than some generic, how does this generally affect the United States? And I said this as somebody who understood ahead of time about these sort of biases, tried to sincerely, you know, trying to not be so biased about it, look what's in the best interest of our nation. But it's only natural that's what happens, you know. It happened with a lot of my colleagues. You know, I had other colleagues of mine who I became very close friends with. Some colleagues, say, for example, from the American Midwest, that if you started talking about the Pacific and fishing and the Pacific Fleet, I mean, their eyes would glaze over. But all of a sudden you talk about, you know, hey, grain prices in Kansas or Iowa or Nebraska, and they are zeroing and they are paying way close attention to what you have to say here. So for those of you who are going to become Homeland Security professionals, that is a tip, that is a pointer that I would strongly encourage you to just keep in the back of your mind and be conscious and be aware of when you're talking about Congress. Now, that's not to say big national issues are irrelevant. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying, though, is that the reality is that the majority of the work of Congress and the majority of work of congressmen is very local. I will grant you that the big national issues of the day. So when I was in Congress, one of the biggest issues of the day was Obamacare. You know, or you know, more recently we've had big national fights over, you know, tax reform, big national fights over immigration. Those big national issues, yeah, I get it. Members of Congress are very focused in on what and how the country as a whole is thinking and feeling. But for the majority of professionals, Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Department of Transportation, when you're coming before your subject matter committees, or when you're going before the Appropriations Committee, they are, the overwhelming majority of issues are not big, gigantic national issues like what do we do about immigration in the United States of America, or what do we do about setting the tax code? And as a consequence, be sharp, be smart, talk and figure out a way to hone your proposals for the audience for which you're in front of, and that's congressmen who are hired and fired by voters in their particular districts. I can keep talking. I can explain. I'd be happy to go into a little bit more of the committee process and how the budgeting committee process goes. Happy to talk a little bit more about my experiences as a veteran and whatnot here. But maybe let me just pause here. I don't know, Alison or Alex, do you want me to start taking some questions? How do you want to proceed?
Yeah, that has been great, Charles, so far, and I believe that overview has been so valuable, and thank you for your willingness to accommodate audience preferences here. So participants, if you could drop on the chat, a remark if you would like Charles for driving deeper, or taking a deeper dive, talking about fishing and water-related things, taking a deeper dive. And that was a great picture that you used. So that was a great metaphor illustration. Do you want Charles to take a deeper dive into the federal budgeting process with some examples that relate to Homeland Security, or his counterterrorism experience, like kinetic experience in Afghanistan? Or also, I think it would be very valuable to quiz Charles about his experience with mitigation in Hawaii, and
yeah.
zoning and something that I would be interested in, for example. Maybe I can talk you into sharing some of your experience related to that, because state level is very important to us, and we are an original state in the East, and Hawaii is the latest addition, if you will. And I've been there, and it's wonderful. So if you
good, come back.
Help students enhance their perspectives, and then in the meantime, if participants could drop their topics they'd be interested in exploring with Charles a little further, if you could drop that in the chat, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure, Alex, why don't we do this? Let me go into a little bit more of the committee process, some of the misconceptions I think a lot of people have about Congress, and then I'd be also happy to talk a little bit about my experiences in municipal government.
Sounds good. Perfect.
So,
thank you.
One thing, another aspect I think a lot of professionals, very, very bright individuals have, is they don't understand the committees. They don't understand how the committees in Congress work and interact and work with one another. For example, I very frequently hear people talking about, hey, look, there's a House Budget Committee, there's a House Ways and Means Committee, there's a House Appropriations Committee, there's a House Homeland Security Committee, there's a House Armed Services Committee. How do these cats work, or do they even work? Of course, the whole concept of Congress working is, maybe an oxymoron, but let me explain. Okay, in the budgeting process, the key committees to know are the Budget Committee, the Ways and Means, and the Appropriations Committee. But let me explain how each of these three committees kind of sort of work with one another here. In 1974, Congress passed the Budget Reform Act. That created the Budget Committee. There's a House Budget Committee and a Senate Budget Committee. The Budget Committee nominally is the parent committee or the senior committee. Nominally, what the Budget Committee does is it sets the overall size of the federal budget. How much is the federal government every year going to spend? How much every year are we going to generate in revenue to meet that spending? And of course, for the last quarter of that century, spending has been way higher than revenues, and the resulting delta is the budget deficit. Okay, nominally, that sounds like that's important. Now, it is. But that's not the so-called power committee in the United States Congress. although the budget committee sets the overall size of the federal budget, how much we spend, how much we're going to generate in revenues, and general big chunks in terms of overall top line numbers, that's not the committee most members of Congress are clamoring to get on. The committees that they really want to get on is either appropriations or ways and means. And let me explain why. Although the budget committee sets the overall size of the budget, it then, after setting the overall size of the budget, breaks it in two. The spending side goes to the appropriations committee. The revenue side, how we generate the money to support the federal government, that goes to ways and means. And as a quick note here, in the House of Representatives, it's called the Ways and Means Committee. In the United States Senate, it's called the Finance Committee. Why do we do that? I have no idea, other than to confuse graduate students. I have no idea, but it's the same thing, okay? So House Ways and Means, Senate Finance, same thing, okay? Why does everybody want to get on those committees? It's because the Appropriations Committee, although they have to take instructions from the Budget Committee in terms of overall spending, the Appropriations Committee has line item control, okay? So the Budget Committee says, federal government, this year, we're going to spend, $3 trillion. Great. So the Appropriations Committee then gets the instruction from the Budget Committee, and the Appropriations then says, okay, we can spend up to $3 trillion, but they get to decide the individual line items to add up to $3 trillion. So for example, they'll say, out of the $3 trillion, we're going to spend so much money on the defense budget. And in the defense budget, we're going to go so much money to the Army or the Navy. We're going to spend so much money on Homeland Security. But in the Homeland Security budget, Penn State has this really good Homeland Security program over there. Let's throw an extra $10 million for Penn State Harrisburg to build a brand new building to house all of the Homeland Security students over there at the wonderful Penn State Harrisburg. Those line items are what's power. It's individual members being able to slip in an extra line for additional spending, keeping in mind that the Budget Committee cannot go over the cap and overall spending that's set by the Budget Committee, okay? On the revenue side, it's the same thing except in inverse. On the revenue side, the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, they are setting the tax rates. They're the committee responsible for figuring out how do we generate the amount of revenue, how much money we take in from the American people, how much we get from the taxpayers, set by the Budget Committee. So again, let me give you an example. Budget Committee says we're going to spend $3 billion and we're going to raise $2 billion in taxes. Well, the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, well, they got to raise $2 trillion in revenue. And they'll say, okay, we're going to raise it in income tax, and we're going to raise it in corporate tax, and we're going to raise it in tariffs or whatever it might be. But again, their power is in the ability to give an individual line item tax break to particular companies or individuals that are favored for whatever reason. So the Budget Committee says, yeah, okay, Ways and Means and Finance, you got to find a way to generate $2 trillion in taxes. But hey, look, Penn State Harrisburg has really great students. We want to encourage more people to major in Homeland Security Studies over at Penn State. So, hey, if you major in Homeland Security Studies, we're going to cut in an individual line item tax break that you don't have to pay income tax so long as you're a student at Penn State University, Harrisburg, okay? That line item power, that line item control is why everybody wants to get on Senate Finance and House Ways and Means. Now, the thing is, prior to 1974, Congress had for a very long time had both an Appropriations Committee as well as a Ways and Means Committee. But you can already see the problem. The incentive of the Appropriations Committee is always to increase spending, to find more and more ways to shove additional monies to particularly favored industries. The Ways and Means Committee has an interest to cut taxes or to give tax breaks, constantly giving tax breaks. And what was happening was a widening gap and a problem with our budget deficit continuing to just expand. the budget committee was supposed to fix all of this because the budget committee is supposed to be sitting over the appropriations and ways and means, try and find a way that we don't have such a big gap, and forcing appropriations to cap its spending and forcing ways and means to generate a sufficient amount of revenue. That was a theory. You know, it worked for a little while in maybe part of the 1970s. It functioned for a little while during the 90s, but I'll be totally honest with all of you here. Today, this process is broken. It does not work, and budget deficit has just been exploding for the last 2 decades in our government. And so it's a nice theory. It's nice that in principle it's all there, but it just has not. It hasn't been functional. Other key terms that maybe I can highlight for all of you is, and again, I'd be happy to explain any of these in more detail. Happy to go into this a little bit more for any of you who might be interested in it here. You hear frequently this term continuing resolution that gets bandied about and whatnot here. Let me explain. So Congress, in theory, is supposed to pass a budget every year. That's the budget resolution I was telling you about. Supposed to, in theory, pass a tax bill from Ways and Means. It's supposed to pass 13 separate appropriations bills, which add up to the amount of spending from appropriations that the Budget Committee originally said. That's the theory. The United States of America has actually not done that, or we've only done, I think, like 3 times in the last 20 years. It is really, really, yeah, disastrous and bad. Congress is no longer functioning. The partisanship divide is so deep and so bad that the Congress has not been able to pass a budget. We've not been able to pass appropriations bills. And so what happens here is in order to keep the federal government running, what they do is they've been falling back upon something called a continuing resolution. Now, a continuing resolution, according to the Budget Control Act of 1974, was supposed to be the exception to the rule. It was supposed to be, and it was originally designed as an emergency measure that would very rarely be used. It was intended that in the exceptional, highly rare circumstance where Congress cannot get its act together, all Congress would do was take the last time a budget, appropriations bill, and tax bills were properly passed and just continue it, just extend it out for 1 additional year. And the hope and the thought was if we just continue it for 1 additional year, the next year, well, we'll get around to actually passing a budget resolution, actually passing appropriations bills, and actually pass a tax bill as we're supposed to. Well, what has happened here is there's been just such bitter partisan divide in the Congress for the last 2 decades. The fiscal affairs have completely broken down. And what has happened, what was originally intended as an emergency stopgap, once in a while, rare occurrence, has now become regular. Congress has just been extending and extending and extending these continuing resolutions, just going back to the last budget that was actually passed. And I think that was, I'm trying to recall when it was the last time we actually passed the budget and got it through. I think it was in the administration of George W. Bush. So we're going to go back 3 presidents ago. And we just keep on extending it. And it's not good. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat here. I mean, everybody who studies this agrees that this process is broken. It's not working. And it's just a crazy disaster. Some other key terms here, and I see there's a question on rebuilding in Afghanistan. I'll get into that in just a second. Another frequent question I get from folks about Congress and being a member of Congress and what it's like over there here is you oftentimes hear this phrase earmark, and people say, well, what the heck is an earmark, right? It's something it's like an earring or something. I mean, okay, what an earmark is it's pork. But a lot of people misunderstand how an earmark is or what it works. A lot of people think what an earmark is that a member of Congress goes in and just stuffs a few extra $1 million into a particular budget and gets something like, a new building for Penn State Harrisburg or something like that. A earmark is actually a lot more subtle than that. the way an earmark works is that Congress has put out its budget, Appropriations Committee puts out its budget, okay? And it says we shall spend X number of dollars on a particular function. So again, for example, it says the United States Congress shall this year spend $100 billion on Homeland Security, okay? What an earmark is it adds a very simple phrase. You insert into the bill, Congress shall spend $100 billion on Homeland Security, comma, provided, however, that 10 million out of that $100 million shall go for the construction of a brand new building at Penn State Harrisburg, right? So that's when an earmark, it doesn't technically actually add money to the budget. It just further specifies how money should be spent. And the biggest budget, of course, Congress members do that, is in the defense budget, which is by far the biggest budget, discretionary budget in Congress. Actually, the biggest part of congressional spending is actually entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. That comprises the majority of the government spending. But Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, if you're not willing to reform it, you can't touch it. And so that's why the defense budget is the one that gets the richest amount of spending. Okay, I saw some questions here. One question was, recent news reports of the US dollar is being wasted on Afghanistan rebuilding. Thoughts? This is a difficult one for me. So I did serve in Afghanistan. I served a 3rd Brigade, 10th Mountain in 2011, 2012 in Kandahar. You know, Colin Powell once said, you know, the U.S. military ultimately operates on Pottery Barn rule, that if you break it, you own it. And that's what I think the United States has going on here in Afghanistan. I think there's a clear sense of weariness in our nation about Afghanistan. You know, there's both Republicans and Democrats saying that, you know, it's time for us to finally get out. But at the same time, I think our nation is also very conscious of the fact that getting out in a rushed, hurly-burly manner is also not helpful for our country as a whole. You know, our American experience in what happened when we abandoned Vietnam in the 1970s, I think is still and continues to be a searing experience for the American people. You know, when I was over in Afghanistan, I certainly saw a lot of waste over there. I do think it can be done a heck of a lot more efficiently. How do we fix it? I mean, ultimately, the best way to fix it is we have a functional, honest, not corrupt democracy working in Afghanistan. We are a light year away from that. The government in Afghanistan is better than the Taliban. You know, I think that the new president, Ghani, is better than Karzai was in Afghanistan. But we are still a long, long ways off. And I wish I had a better answer. I wish I could tell you, if we just did this, we can fix all this waste going on in Afghanistan. But gosh, if I did that, I'd run for president. I don't have a good answer for you and how we fix that and how we get that down. Okay, talk about different titles under the budget, specifically the DoD. Do you have realizations? Oh, okay. So this question here is about titles, and the question is about, well, how does the DoD budget turn into Title 10, Title 22, so on and so forth here. Okay, maybe let me back up here a little bit to explain these titles and how it works. And you'll very frequently hear this when you guys graduate from Penn State and start working in Homeland Security or in DoD. Federal law is codified, meaning statutes are written into the United States Code. If you go into a law library, you will see volumes and volumes. I think it's about like 50 or 60 volumes of books. The United States Code is all of the laws of the entire United States of America, okay? The US Code then is in turn broken into what's called titles. So there's a title for the Department of Agriculture, there's a title for the Department of Interior, there's a title for the Department of Homeland Security. Title 10, which is one of the thickest and most frequently cited titles, governs the US Defense Department. Now, the way members of Congress, you change a title, or the way something gets into that here, one of two ways. A, you just write a law. Any member of Congress can submit a bill. And if you remember from elementary school, you know how a bill goes to Capitol Hill and passes and whatnot here, passes both chambers of Congress, signed by the President of the United States, that Congressman's power to write a law will go in and specifically say, I want to change, or I want to add, or I want to modify this specific sentence or phrase or paragraph of this particular section of a particular title of the United States Code, okay? So that's one way to do it. You just go in and submit a bill and say, look, I want to change, modify, add, delete this particular section of this title of the US Code. The other way you do it is through these authorization bills, which I had explained a little bit earlier. That fishing license, after Congress passes it, actually gets translated into the United States Code. The parliamentarian will take the authorization bill that's passed the floor of the House and the Senate, modify it, and actually insert it in the United States Code. And once it's inserted in the United States, they will be the agency that determines what title it actually affects or changes. Once it goes into the title of the United States Code, that is US law. And if you violate it, that's what you call against the law. And yeah, you can go to prison. So that's not a good idea. Don't do that. But yeah, that's how Homeland Security works the exact same way, just like the Defense Department, excuse me, or for that matter, transportation or interior or education and whatnot here. Typically being that it is the subject matter. So any member of Congress goes in and says, I want to add, delete, change, modify a particular section of the United States Code. That bill gets referenced to a subject matter committee. So if it's related to the military, it goes to Armed Services. If it's related to Homeland Security, it's going to go to the Committee on Homeland Security. And that committee is going to review that bill and say, hey, look, is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? Should we do this? Should we not do this? To make that addition, modification, change to that particular section of that title of the United States Code. So hopefully that explains it here. So other questions or other things you guys want me to, Alex, you had asked me about zoning and municipal government and whatnot here. Let me touch on that real quickly also here. So municipal governments in the United States generally are the agency or the level of government that deals with land use. So again, federal government, theoretically, the United States of America does with big national issues, armed services, foreign affairs, currency, borders, immigration into the United States. But usually it's the municipal government, your state, county or city governments that actually determine land use. Land use is one of these esoteric areas, but really, really important in determining what a particular area of land can or cannot be used for. For example, can or cannot be used for residential housing, or can or cannot be used for commercial or industrial. This does not directly affect Homeland Security, but can tangentially affect Homeland Security because it plays a lot into crime and criminal affairs. Very frequently, municipal governments recognize that when you change zoning, you can increase or decrease criminal activity in a particular area. It is very common that particular parts of a city may become downtrodden, may become inner city, may become beset with crime. And by merely changing the zoning, you can sometimes revitalize a particular area of a particular municipality and thereby revitalize that portion of a community. And so Homeland Security, criminal justice professionals do have to be conscious and aware of this here. And it is a useful tool that, yeah, you don't always necessarily need a whole bunch of police officers going into an area to try and reduce crime. But yeah, sometimes if you can just create economic incentives by changing a particular area, say from industrial to say commercial, put in shopping malls and put in condos, that in and of itself can reduce sometimes, and it doesn't always work, sometimes actually significantly reduce criminal activities. And actually it is something that is a useful tool. And so, yeah, I don't know if land use is a required course for your guys' masters, but it is something I would encourage you guys to take a look at here. Alex, I think I cut you off. Did you have a question?
No, that was great. I just wanted to say thank you for answering to that, because that's an important, I think that's an important cross connection. I would, if nobody else has, I have a question from your experience, as a legislator and a representative, and then also as a uniformed service member. During the Trump presidency, and even starting with the Obama presidency, we had this concept of the strategic and operational integration of Homeland Security and national defense and national security. With the interim strategic guidance out of the Biden administration, there is not unexpectedly more focus on, defending values and democracy and freedom. So, and it doesn't, I mean, we still have to see the next national security strategy, but the guidance doesn't say anything, unless I missed, about, a pillared structure like the previous national security of 2017 said, where it had Homeland Security as actually the first pillar of national security. So, what's your take on that? Do you like that the trend? Do you think that continues, or it's already integrated enough Homeland Security and national defense, so it's not going to, is that going? How is that marriage going to look in 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago? From now, and from your point of view.
Yeah. So you actually raised a really, really good point, and this is something that I think we, the United States of America, need to do a much, much better job of, and that is making a more seamless integration between not just Homeland Security and defense, but Homeland Security and defense and our State Department and the U.S. Treasury Department to sync together and work together, that everybody is rowing in the same direction. 20, 30, 40 years ago, when the United States of America had the biggest economy in the world, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the fact that the United States of America, that our government was a little discoordinated, that we weren't quite in sync with one another, honestly, it didn't matter. We were just the big dog in town. And yeah, fine, we weren't, quite nicely groomed, didn't quite all sync together here. We were just so big, so much more powerful than any other nation on planet Earth. It didn't matter. The fact that there were these hiccups between Homeland Security and national defense and Treasury and foreign policy, I mean, we could have glossed them over. September 11th exposed a gap in our problem. My opinion, however, is going forward, looking into the future, looking towards the year 2040, these gaps are going to hurt the United States of America, because we have this dog that's coming right on our tail that is growing really, really fast and coming in on us, and that's China. And as much as I don't like the Communist Party of China, and I don't, they are far more disciplined, far more coordinated, and they recognize that they're number two and they want to catch the number one dog, us, the United States of America. I do think it's extremely important that the United States get its act together. These ideas of turf battles between Homeland Security and defense and state and Treasury are not helpful. Further, we are also not only vertically stratified in the United States, we're horizontally stratified, meaning there's a federal level of security, but there's also a state level and a municipal level of security, making us extremely disorganized. But in some ways, I mean, disorganized historically for a reason. I mean, the United States as a nation has distrusted centralized power, which I for the record, I think is a good thing. I mean, our American democracy is couched in part that nobody should have all the influence and power in our nation. That was all fine and good, I think, during the Cold War. It was all fine and good for the first couple of decades after the Cold War. But I think it requires okay, and I got to take this is my opinion. This is not, this is not doctrinaire or whatnot here. My opinion here is it's going to require a strong, active executive branch, a president, and the presidency. And, throughout American history, there's been lots and lots of swings in influence as to whether the legislative branch is more powerful or the executive branch is more powerful, which one. And I'm not saying get rid of the legislative branch at all. I'm not saying all of that. What I am saying here is I think looking forward into the future, we need a stronger, more robust executive branch. We need a president who understands this. And I'm not gonna get into the Trump versus Biden and who's better, but I am gonna say that for the long-term health future of our nation, of the United States of America, we've got to break down all these walls vertically between the various departments, as well as horizontally between the various levels of government, and make sure that all of our security professionals are singing on the same sheet of music, because A, that's a good idea and we should do it. And B, if we don't, gosh, to be blunt, the Chinese are going to eat our lunch. We have a competitor here that is coming right on us. And if we don't get our act together, they are going to surpass us, and they're going to. And as bad as September 11th was, and it was absolutely horrible, but ultimately at the end of the day, Al-Qaeda and the radical Islamic terrorists, they have nothing on the amount and capacity and will that China is going to have. Al-Qaeda is a pin drop compared to what the Chinese Communist Party can bring to bear on global affairs. And again, that's my opinion. You can take it or leave it. Value it for the worth that you guys are paying for it, I guess.
Thank you, Charles. And we certainly understand that this is your personal opinion, but thank you for sharing it. And it's now also, it's getting 6 o'clock. Oh. That's our end time. And since we are unable to meet in person, I would at least virtually present you with this certificate of appreciation. I hope that you like it.
Awesome. Well, thank you. No, I really
next door. I hope before you leave with your degree from US Army War College, maybe we can meet in person one way or the other.
Good.
Give you a printed version of this, but Alison is going to email that to you. I hope you like it. So thank you very much for addressing the group. So that's been great. And also thank you for your honesty and also for speaking not just behind the the protective walls of a publicly elected official and whatever, but also being willing to share, and everybody understood when you shared your personal opinion. We're just speaking as a citizen. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you. My delight, my pleasure. Alison has my contact information if any of you want to reach out to me. In the meantime, come visit me in Hawaii. Alex, we'll do this. We'll do the personal exchange. We'll do it on Waikiki Beach in the Hawaiian Islands, okay?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I bring the certificate over.
Okay, sounds good.
I'll do your career. So done deal.
Very good.
Thank you, Charles.
Okay, thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, Alison, for running the show. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Next week, we will have the final presentation, the final webinar session. And presenting will be Randy Patfield, who is the administrator of the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. So same time, same place. I hope we will see you there again. And there will also be, we need to make sure that everybody, Alison, can you quickly comment on, because we didn't publish a link for that before. So how should people proceed if they want to sign up and register for next Monday?
I did post a registration link in the chat, but I will send everybody a link and information for them to get in next week.
Wonderful, very good. Then that completes our penultimate webinar session. I hope to see you all again next week, next Monday. Have a great first spring week and be safe, be good. Like I said.